Good afternoon, all. A warm welcome to everyone. In this webinar, we are going to be looking at what we are doing as UWC as we share our strategies and efforts towards containing and managing gender-based violence, as well as violence against women and children, as we commemorate the 16 days of activism against this scourge. It is really sad and worrying that even at this time of the year, we continue to see high incidents of violence against women and children reported every day. What is even more disturbing is that the nature of this violence is getting more gruesome every time. In a weekly publication in the past week, an investigative officer who specializes on gender-based violent crimes and crimes against women, children, and vulnerable groups behind bars was cited saying, and I quote, "The challenge is that these crimes are not policeable. They happen behind closed doors and under cover of darkness," unquote. In these words, we are reminded of the reality that gender-based violence and crimes against women and children are difficult to police. And there is a need for all of us to come together to fight against these crimes. We have come together here to share our collective response to gender-based violence as different institutional affiliates. And I hope that at the end of this webinar, we will be aware of who is doing what and where, and how we can all together strengthen our response to gender-based violence as UWC. This webinar is divided into two panels, as you have seen in the program. The first panel will share strategies of prevention and response to GBV, and the second panel will look at evidence from research and how the institutional response to gender-based violence could be strengthened. As we proceed with the webinar, please feel free to use the chat space for your questions and comments. We will keep stopping again to address these. Now we will begin with an official welcome from Prof. Joseph Frantz, DVC Research and Innovation. I'll present a summarized bio of Prof. Frantz. Before taking over as DVC, Research and Innovation, Prof. Frantz held the position of Dean at the Faculty of Community and Health Sciences between 2013 and 2017, and Deputy Dean of Research within the same faculty. Prof. Frantz is a C2 NRF rated researcher, and her primary research focus is in health professions, education and faculty development, while her secondary research focus is on providing appropriate health education and health promotion to prevent chronic diseases due to lifestyle. She's committed and passionate about capacity development, something that she is clearly reflected in the number of postgraduate students that she has supervised, and had deep involvement in teaching, learning, and research. She holds a BSc, MSc, and PhD in physiotherapy from the University of the Western Cape. Prof. Frantz is currently the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Research and Innovation at the University of the Western Cape. Over to you, Prof.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Prof.
Okay, thank you. To the moderator of this webinar, Prof. Ngabaza, the panelists this afternoon, the webinar organizers, the Gender Equity Unit and the team, executive members, staff, and students, it is indeed an honor and a pleasure for me to welcome you here this afternoon. The 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence is an annual international campaign, and it normally kicks off on the 25th of November and runs until the 10th of December. And this 16 Days of Activism was was started at the inaugural Women's Global Leadership Institute in 1991 and continues to be coordinated each year by the Center for Women's Global Leadership. And this year, the theme for the 2021 16 Days of Activism is moving from awareness to accountability. I find this topic or theme unique for us as a university. Violence, we know, can happen to any woman, no matter age, education, employment, or culture. According to the latest estimates, nearly 1 in 3 women aged 15 years and older around the world has been subjected to physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner, non-partner, or both, at least once in their lifetime. Those statistics are high, colleagues. It cannot be overlooked in terms of the seriousness of gender-based violence. These numbers do not reflect even the impact of what COVID-19, the pandemic, has done in the circumstances in which we find ourselves. South Africa has amongst the highest prevalence rates of gender-based violence in the world, and the COVID-19 pandemic has been reported to have contributed to an increase of gender-based violence incidences. Here at UWC, we think of many others, but in particular of Jessie S., who was murdered in her home by people we think that she knew during this whole bout of violence. How close to home has it come? How has it impacted us as a university? It really is something that we need to step up and start to respond to. Research conducted by researchers at UWC highlighted that gender-based violence is highly prevalent in many societies throughout the globe. However, the extent of the realities of the gender-based violence in the African context, it seems to be blurred. Research indicates that gender-based violence in cases in Africa are similar to those in Europe and Asia. If we just reflect to the news on a daily basis, does that sound possible? But the question I want to pose this afternoon is, how do we start to address this issue as a society? Universities have a civic responsibility to engage with communities to capacitate and develop for the purpose of health and well-being. Although we as a university, we participate in our service learning modules, etc., what is our response as a university to address this wicked problem that our society is finding? There is a need for universities to approach communities from a standing of being active as opposed to being passive, as this would enhance engagement on matters that we can help address in our communities and in our societies. This webinar is an example of interdisciplinarity, something that I advocate for. We cannot address the wicked problems of society in our silos. We need a view from different lenses to be able to make an impact in how we do this. More so, this webinar brings together academics and support staff from the university to address a problem that not only affects researchers, but affects all of us in society. It is our hope that through this webinar, we are able to highlight the challenges we as a society continue to face and what UWC's response is to this wicked societal problem. I wish all our presenters all of the best this afternoon, and I hope that as we engage with one another and present different views, we will find a way forward as to how we as an institution will engage on this topic of gender-based violence. Be welcome, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for those opening words, and thank you for reminding us that our response to COVID-19 as a nation shows that we can, in the same manner, respond to gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is not a South African ill, but a national pandemic. At this point, I want to welcome some of the executives who have joined the webinar. Prof. Pamela Dube and the Human Resources Director, Mr. Magida. Right, moving on. Our next speaker is Cherith Senga, who is going to present a keynote speech on preventing and responding to gender-based violence in the higher education context. I'll present a shortened bio of Cherith Senga. Cherith is a lecturer in the Department of Criminal Justice and Procedure in the Law Faculty. She holds an LLB from UWC, an LLM from the University of California, Los Angeles, with a specialization in public interest law and policy, focused on gender, health, and human rights. Cherith is presently working on her PhD, which focuses on the corrupt policing of sex work, and she's using a feminist legal analysis lens for her work. She was admitted as an attorney in 2007, and prior to joining UWC in 2018, she has worked in the NPO sector for 10 years. Since joining UWC, Cherith has developed an interest in addressing GBV through higher education curricula. This year, Cherith was awarded the Academic Achievers Emerging Excellent Lecturer Award in the law faculty. We congratulate you for your achievement, Cherith, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for the introduction and for the congratulations for the award. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that everybody is well. I'm struggling with a little bit of a cold, but I'm going to try not to cough while presenting. Before I project my presentation, so I have been tasked with a big job of setting the scene for this webinar. And with setting the scene, you know, there is so much for me to talk about, and I will not be able to cover all of the important and applicable aspects of GBV. But in setting the scene, I want to talk about the fact that everybody comes with a different perspective. And in setting the scene today, you know, it is never possible for one to be objective about talking about issues like gender-based violence and gender inequality, because it's so personal and also so political, and especially as a woman and a woman of color for me. But my perspective today is going to be based on my, obviously partly my subjective experiences, and very much based on my work in NGOs, which is where most of my career has been, most of my work as a lawyer. So obviously also I'm talking from the perspective of a lawyer with experience in doing work around gender and the law. I'm quite a junior academic, but some of the research that I've done now is also going to be informing this input today. I want to acknowledge also before going on to my presentation that so much is already happening at UWC in terms of attempting to prevent and address gender-based violence. There is already a commitment by the university's executive, by academics, by the Gender Equity Unit, which is the backbone of the gender work and our policy around gender and gender-based violence at UWC. So a lot is happening already. There are lots of efforts. This webinar in itself is an indication of the commitment that we have to preventing and reducing gender-based violence in society. It's not only about what happens at our university. Of course, the current context, and Prof. Frantz has spoken about this, I won't spend too much time on it, but we've seen and experienced the gruesome murder of Jessie Hess, one of our own students. We know about Unanini's murder at UWC. But we also acknowledge and recognize that there are so many other manifestations of gender-based violence, and so many other women and gender non-conforming people have died at the hands of GBV, as well as experienced other forms of gender-based violence, such as sexual violence. And I'll touch a bit more on the types and forms of gender-based violence as we go along. But this is the current context in which we live in, high prevalence of gender-based violence. Also, in terms of our awareness, we've seen fees must fall, and we saw the key messages around patriarchy, decolonization, and all of these things that have come up that have also increased our awareness. Not too long ago as well, we had the Me Too campaign, which internationally has also kind of made us focus on sexual harassment. So this is the context in which we're living. This type of webinar is necessary. The work that we're doing is important, and it is having an impact. But I think as a university that we can do even more and expand on our efforts and strengthen what we are doing. So I'm now going to jump into my presentation. I'm about to share my screen. Okay, so let's jump into it. I like to offer a definition of gender-based violence. I'm actually trying to get it. Okay, there we go. In starting out, whenever I've done similar presentations like this before. This is an adapted version, something that is developing constantly through my own research as I develop my ideas. But in terms of gender-based violence, I like to use UN Women's definition. And as you can see over here, UN Women defines GBV as harmful acts directed at an individual or a group of individuals based on their gender. But that definition can be taken further to specifically look at violence against women. And as you can see over here, UN Women says it is any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or mental harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in private or public life. And this definition of violence against women is particularly important because it expands on a very narrow understanding of what gender-based violence is. You'll see over here, and it's always important for me to talk about structural violence. You know, we can have a very narrow definition of violence, which specifically only talks about the kind of physical and sexual violence, which most of us think about automatically when we hear about gender-based violence. A broader understanding and a more fitting understanding of gender-based violence, there are also many other forms and manifestations of it, not just the physical and sexual violence. There are the non-physical forms that are often underestimated, and its impact is often underestimated, but which is very prevalent in our society as well. And structural and systemic violence, it's very important that we recognize and acknowledge it as gendered violence as well. And as you can see, it involves the exclusion of women or deprivation of opportunities and entitlements on a structural and systemic level. And this is how I take this definition very broadly, not only to talk about very specific kind of definitions of gender-based violence that our law, for example, offers. The law does not necessarily adequately deal with or address structural and systemic violence. So when I'm speaking today, I'm speaking about violence very broadly. And it's difficult to talk about structural and systemic violence and to prove it because it is so deeply entrenched in our society in terms of how gender inequality and patriarchy is so deeply normalized in society. So there are many different types of gender-based violence, and I'm not going to spend too much time today on talking through all of them. But on these slides, I've just tried to set up most of them, those which are very obvious to us when we think about gender-based violence, such as sexual violence, domestic violence, but also those that are not as direct. For example, the impact of the criminalization of sex work on women in particular, and the violence that it enables or facilitates against sex workers. And other more indirect forms, such as what does it mean when not all forms of marriages and relationships are recognized in law? What impact does that have on women? There are many more I could talk through, human trafficking, the exclusion of women on many different levels. So really taking the definition of violence very broadly. It is important that we do that so that we do not omit the other manifestations of gender-based violence which have an adverse impact on women and in society. Frantz has already spoken about the prevalence of gender-based violence in South Africa, so I'm not going to spend. You know that research indicates over and over again that South Africa has some of the highest levels of sexual and domestic violence. And these statistics are easier for us to find than for us to find information or this type of quantitative research that looks at the impact of systemic violence, for example. So there's not too much for me to talk about because it's quite limited on what I can talk about on that for purposes of what I'm trying to explain in terms of prevalence. But these are some of the recent studies here. You can see the Medical Research Council, National Department of Health, and the DHS program in 2016. Here's some of the numbers. 1 in 5 women over 18 years experience physical violence and 6% experience sexual violence perpetrated by an intimate partner. Research has always indicated between 1 in 3 to 1 in 5 women experience violence in their lifetimes. And as Prof. Frantz already said, there has been an increase in sexual offences reports during COVID. It has at least increased by 5%. Also sexual harassment, as you can see, 30% of women and 18% of men have indicated sexual harassment in the workplace. So we understand, as I'm just confirming what Prof. Frantz has already spoken about. I want to talk about the causes of GBV, or what my research and what I've learned in my work has come up, what it has come up in terms of the most common causes of gender-based violence. And this is not a closed list. Gender-based violence is undoubtedly an expression of unfair discrimination against women, which flows from this deeply entrenched patriarchy and gender inequity or gender inequality. Men's use of violence against women, and I say this again, and against men, and I'll explain why I say that, is linked to toxic masculinity and patriarchy, which flows from harmful gender norms, which are taught and promoted through society, culture, religion, and even the law. Specifically, if we look at the law historically, and especially now in terms of how the laws relating to gender-based violence are implemented. Violence has also been taught to men in South Africa through colonization and apartheid, because men, particularly men of color, have been taught how to use violence as problem solving through our history of colonization and apartheid. And this does not mean that men who are not of color, that white men don't use violence. They certainly do. And I think that all of the different causes that I talk about today, we need to look at them collectively and contextualize them, within our history and where we find ourselves as a society presently. Also, socioeconomic conditions, how poverty plays a role in exacerbating violence against women. And also then the use of violence, which is exacerbated often by excessive use of alcohol and drugs. I never talk about the use of alcohol and drugs as being a cause, but rather how it exacerbates some of the other factors. But again, I say we need to look at all of these aspects and causes collectively, and we need to contextualize them to get an understanding of why gender-based violence is so prevalent in society. When I talk about toxic masculinities, I'm talking about how men or boys from when they are born are taught how to use control, taught how to use aggression and power in order to prove that they are men or proper men. When they fail to do so, they are often not seen as good enough men or living up to that standard of men, of what society expects men to be. And with this, I also want to acknowledge that we know that violence between men themselves, or male on male violence, is also very common, and that there are high levels of violence. And I think that this is also caused by this toxic masculinity and patriarchy. An acknowledgement for me to make. We know the impact of gender-based violence on survivors. It's very broad and it manifests in various ways. Anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, PTSD are all very common impacts of gender-based violence. Feelings of insecurity and not feeling safe, distrusting others, and it's very difficult to navigate or experience the world or continue living when experiencing these sorts of effects of gender-based violence. In terms of structural and systemic violence, what impact that has on women in terms of the unfair distribution of resources, which effectively affects women's quality of life, income, health, and education. And when I'm talking about women, let me say this again now, and I'm sure that this topic is going to come up a bit more, but also when talking about gender non-conforming persons, LGBTQIAs, how they are also at the receiving end of violence because of failing to conform with a particular standard or construction of gender. Gender-based violence and the law, I will not spend too much time on this today, but in South African law, we have several statutes that attempt to address or provide redress for victims of gender-based violence. We know our Constitution talks about gender equality in Section 9, as well as in Section 12, the right to be free from all forms of violence from private sources and public sources. We have the Domestic Violence Act, protection from harassment. In employment law, we have the Employment Equity Act. In criminal law, there are several corresponding criminal offences for violence. And we can go on and on. We do, however, know that while we have this body of law it's meant to provide redress often, and in many ways does not necessarily prevent gender-based violence in the ways that society as it stands now currently needs it. There are several issues also with the implementation of these laws. I mean, in itself, having as a survivor of gender-based violence, of trying to navigate or use the system, how intimidating it is, the retaliation by abusers when electing to use the system. And then very importantly, poor performance and gender inequitable attitudes on the part of state actors or role players who are tasked with implementing the various legal systems, the criminal justice system and the other legal systems relating to protection from harassment or domestic violence, for example. The big issue is that I don't think that the law is doing enough in terms of the prevention of gender-based violence. And I think that this is the critical point of entry for universities and higher education. So higher education can certainly play a critical role in contributing to preventing and addressing gender-based violence. The reason why I say this is because higher education brings together youth, young people, as well as specialists, us as lecturers and other members of staff, who are equipped with sharing knowledge and educating students and preparing them for real life, in fact, or preparing them for the workplace. So in terms of addressing gender-based violence, why is it important and why is it that the university should do it? I think the university can play a critical role in changing approaches and attitudes towards gender inequality in terms of working with young people so that we can see this impact positively on young people's intimate relationships, in their families, communities, in our higher education institutions, as well as in the workplaces that young people will form part of. So we basically are sitting with the situation. We have great and important access for people who can change, who can really contribute to reducing gender-based violence and preventing it. By omitting to identify and address gender inequality, patriarchy, toxic masculinities in our teaching, our messaging, and our responses to gender-based violence, we as the university will in fact be contributing to normalizing and reproducing gender-based violence in all its forms. And I say this, and going back to what I said at the beginning before I started speaking, we know and acknowledge that we already have several efforts and several ways in which we are attempting to address gender-based violence through our curriculum. So I've said this before in other presentations. I believe that higher education institutions can approach gender inequality and toxic masculinities, which go to the root of gender-based violence, and that we can do this in a similar way to which we are prioritizing the Africanization and decolonization of the curriculum. Higher education institutions, our responsibility, I believe, is to unlearn, unteach, and correct the construction and perpetuation of gender inequality, toxic masculinities, and patriarchy. It is only in doing this that we will be able to see a reduction in gender-based violence. Due to the fact that the historical and traditional basis of our curriculum is often originates from patriarchal ideas and practices, it is important that as students and as lecturers, we are critical of what we are teaching. We want our students to think critically. We want our students to challenge us in terms of what we teach. Students need to be encouraged to engage with the curricula in a critical and constructive way in order to eradicate these different manifestations of gender inequality. We need to be open to that, and we need to encourage it even more. Students need to be taught about different forms of gender-based violence, its causes and its impacts. And specifically, I'm highlighting here the non-physical forms of GBV and being aware of how structural and systemic gender-based violence works and impacts on people. We need to equip students with knowledge on how to respond to victims of GBV, how to support them. They need to know where to go to in order to obtain services for, or ways in which to support victims of gender-based violence or survivors of gender-based violence. I sometimes use those terms interchangeably depending on the context. Also, alternative ways of dealing with conflict, particularly for men and boys. It's very important that we have these discussions and try to equip our students with different ways of dealing with conflict and with problem solving. Gender and masculinities should certainly be mainstream in the curriculum across faculties. It should not only be covered in gender studies courses offered by women's and gender studies or in selected courses in arts and humanities, but it should be mainstream throughout different faculties. It should be one of the ways in the lenses that's used in terms of how we teach and how we are critical of what is being taught and what we teach. And it should certainly not only be about individual women's rights champions or social justice champions in the various faculties. It needs to be mainstreamed and become part of everything that we do, because we know this is a scourge and we need to address it. It's imperative that we do this. Also, in terms of resources, we need more resources to be designated for GBV services and for support programs for victims of. All students and staff must be able to know where to access information services so that we can of ourselves when we experience gender-based violence, but also our colleagues and fellow students, etc. The messages communicated to students through teaching and university media and communications must consistently respond to and seek to address GBV in all its forms. And I've seen that happening with the university, but I think we can do even more of that. Messaging is critical. It plays such a critical role in normalizing ideas and responses and how we think about gender-based violence. Lecturers must certainly be open to questioning their own gender bias based on their personal experience and histories of gender privilege and oppression, so that the curriculum that we teach is critical of indirect and direct forms of gender inequality, by thinking about our positions as lecturers and what we teach, where we come from. And here, modeling is critical. You know, we need to see our male lecturers speaking openly about gender-based violence, about their privilege, as men in society, and about accountability to other men to model responses to GBV and gender inequality. And this is the next thing I'm going to say. It is not a standalone suggestion. So using gender equitable language and scenarios and examples in our teaching and assessments to promote and challenge and normalize gender equality. It's not something that must be done as its own, but it does contribute to normalizing. Many of the other suggestions I've made needs to be done in conjunction with that. Similarly, with study resources and materials, what work are we giving? What are the sources that we are sharing with our students? What are these authors really writing about? What are the underlying messages? What are they normalizing in terms of gender and gender-based violence? So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm going to end sharing my slide now. And like I say, there is much more to talk about, but I hope that I have effectively set the scene for what is going to be said today and the discussions that we're going to have. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Cherith, for setting the scene indeed, by reminding us of what GBV is, for reminding us its collective causes and how it is necessary that these are contextualized. And thank you for reminding us that the law is not doing much to address gender-based violence. However, you emphasize that as a university, we do have a role to unteach gender-based violence in our curriculum. And thank you for reminding the university that gender studies should not carry the load. Everyone should take the responsibility. We now move over to our panels. And as we do so, may I highlight that some of the information in the presentations might share graphic content, which might be sensitive and disturbing to some participants as we are dealing with the issues of violence. So just to warn everyone. So our first speaker in this panel is Naythan Kayser from the Center of Student Support and Services. Over to you, Naythan.
Thank you so much, Prof. I am just getting my screen up as we go. Because Hardy is still sharing. There we go. Hardy, do you have my slideshow on standby? For some reason, the technical gods are now not working for me. Thank you so much, Melody. I'm just checking if Melody has the updated one, but it's fine. We can use that one. I think that's the outdated one, but that's okay. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much to firstly, I think the GEU and everybody involved for giving this opportunity for us to tackle this problem and to do it in a time frame that it's so important to speak around the violence, specifically gender-based violence and gender violence against women and children. And so for us and CSSS, we were asked to speak about the significance of the rape crisis first responder training that we offer, and how that is such an important offering to the UWC community. And so I'm going to start off by just talking about it in the next slide, talking about it and giving a bit of context to the training. Thank you so much for that, Melody. So the context of the training is that this is really under a specific project that CSSS has applied for, which is called the Gender Equality and Empowerment Project. And through our leadership of Prof. Dube, that is present here today, we have pushed this agenda forward under a UCDG grant. And now I need to say this UCDG grant is a grant that is a development grant that is for academic development, mentoring programs. And so we've got a lot of backlash, firstly, when we applied for a social justice program and a specifically gender-based violence program that is situated within a student development and support, and then also focusing, you know, more on co-curricular work. And so we were told, we don't know if you're going to get this money to do this work. Well, guess what? We are here and we've got that money. And it just shows that the higher education still sees this work as important, and specifically having to do this kind of work within the higher education setting with students and staff. And so what we do is we really try and aim and work around the goal of a strategic goal for UWC is to make the student campus enhancing the student campus and enhancing the student the experience on campus through a safer campus. And through a safer campus, meaning that they need to feel safe to report and to go to access services of gender-based violence and sexual violence in this case. And I'm going to use the terms gender-based violence and sexual violence interchangeably and also independently, because I do think we need to realize that those are two different things that works on its own. And then also what I think is very important of this, the GEEP program, as we call it, is that we have a research component that is built into the program. And that is in order to contribute towards the need for social innovations, new knowledge generation, improve the documentation, and promise practice and challenge experience to contribute to UWC's own evidence base and contribution to global research on the important area. So we don't just implement projects and we implement activities, but we have a researcher appointed for the next 3 years that is walking this journey with us to really, and she's actually a Dr. Palm, is to really walk the journey with us to capture everything that needs to be captured and see, are we doing it right? Are the students really receiving it in the right way? And where are we going towards this? So the rape crisis first responder training in the next slide is one of the ways of responding in the GEEP program at the moment. And what we find why this is important is that stakeholders across campus has been managing incidents, you know, independently, the silo syndrome that we spoke about. And what was required for is a more integrated institutional approach to gender-based violence and sexual violence. And we thought by initiating the rape crisis first responder training as a training firstly for our STS and student development services staff, but also all other staff on campus would be a way of capacity building, but equipping them with the necessary skills and knowledge on how to deal with students and all our campus goers in a specialized trauma and survivor a specific way, and to make sure that the experience that these survivors have when they access the service is sensitized and inclusive. And the inclusivity is very important in this case. So I think what we're trying to do, and I need to mention this as well, because I know the director of HR is here, is that prior to this grant, we really struggled somehow to get the funds together, and HR immediately pulled in 1 year and said, we're willing to fund one of these trainings because it's important training. And so we hope for a sustainable model post our first responder training and post the grant that we get, because we know grants don't last forever, is that HR would walk hand in hand with us as we offer this training to all UWC first responders. And so it really looks at different aspects of responding to sexual violence and gender-based violence on campus, and looking at how we report, how we investigate the healthcare, the psychological issues, and most importantly, the criminal justice system, and how we should be careful in ways of how we deal with it in the university and higher education setting. And so I'm going to talk you through what is covered through this training, and what are the first responders at the moment, what do they get when they get this training. And so I need to note that Rape Crisis is our service provider, and we've actually went into an MOU with Rape Crisis for these 3 years to offer this training, the specialized training to us. And before even that, there was already a group of first responders trained, and so far we've trained almost 50 first responders on campus since the inception of this. And so one of the first things they look at through this training is that what is rapes, what are the myths, and what are the social norms. And I think it's important through this is that when a first responder deals with the case is that they don't look at the myths and how you come and how you address and how you present yourself or the body that you're presented in, is that they are looking at the sexual violence, the act that has taken place. And so they really walk us through that journey. And just like Masanga has just said, that biases that is within us, you know, that underlying biases when it comes to reporting rape. And why is there hesitancy? And some of the hesitancy is always about the biases that exist. And so then we go and we walk a journey. We talked about what do we do when we face with rape and how to support a survivor, talking the survivor through the process. What is happening next? Where will you go? The support of the Thuthuzela Care Center. This is an important center and a relationship that UWC has formed through CPS and through therapeutic services. And we can activate that service immediately. And so the Thuthuzela Care Center is something that walks a journey with you through the criminal justice, making the case, making sure that forensics is taken care of, that even to every aspect that investigation is done. So when you are reporting it immediately, that you are preserved, the forensics preserved, and that everything, the journey is taken with you, you walk through the journey from there. And then we go through the rape psychological, the gender, the sex and sexuality, and how that falls in place. The rape legal processes and procedures. What is the processes? Can we inform students about these processes? What are we allowed to talk to them about? I've got my time, Juliana, thank you. The pathway to the criminal justice system, and then the pathway to the university and the care for the caregiver. This last point is so important. I'm going to talk about it now for the last bit that I have left is, the rape crisis talks us through our structure. What is existing services? How are we helping students at the moment? What can we do more? And how do we journey with them through this traumatic event? But how do we become not just a service, but more an advocacy lens and voice for them through this time? And so in the next slide, I'm talking a little bit more about what we've covered and how we'll be doing it. Is Melody there for the next slide? There we go. So the training benefits is really capacitating first responders. It creates a sense of accountability measure for GBV and rape cases on campus. We know now that cases go to first responders, and these first responders trained. I want to speak a little bit more about the establishment of platform for staff to navigate and discuss centralized institutional response. It brings a best practice model to the table. It creates a space for institutional sexual violence policy to become more than just a document. And it's important that we talk about that institutional sexual violence policy become an implementing document. There's an implementation plan that goes along with it. And one of these things that through the leadership of Prof Dube is that what we're doing is trying to do some implementation strategies. We can now look at monitoring and evaluation measures as well, and how we collaborate as an institution, moving away from the silos like from Frantz has said, and really coming together, because this is an issue that affects everybody, lecturers, support staff, everybody at UWC. And so lastly, I'm going to speak about the gaps and the way forward. Firstly, we've identified that first responder training should be available to most of the employees of the university. Actually, lecturers, faculty, staff, the cleaners, the security staff, everybody needs to get first responder training, mainly to know how to deal with these cases, with the sensitivity and having the trauma and survivor-centered approach when you deal with a student. It creates and revive and how we can create and revive a gender policy. And this is so important because we speak about the sexual harassment policy and a sexual violence policy. And you really brought this forward through the training, is that the gender policy is so important, because when we speak about gender-based violence, we speak about all forms of gender violence. And like Masanga said, men on men, the violence based on your gender and your expression of gender. And for me, as a queer body, I know how important that is. And the way I express my gender, how afraid I am of where I express my gender and how I express my gender, and the possible forms of violence that might be, practiced on me. And then also have a community of practice. Now we have staff members from all over campus, from admin to student support, within research and academic staff that is coming together, being first responders, and we can share ideas and we can talk through this system, and we can actually just be together and be a support to each other as we tackle the issue of GBV and sexual violence on campus. We've established a centralized, and this is important that we need to do as UWC. It's a huge gap that we have, and it's establishing a centralized reporting system where survivors can report sexual violence cases at UWC, and then we activate a first responder, wherever the first responder is. At the moment, we're training first responders because students go to these first responders. But if we have a very centralized and a sophisticated reporting system, these first responders would be activated immediately when it comes to different points of reporting. And then last 2 points, to make first responders known. First responders said that people need to know who we are. How can we do it? Through marketing, through just showing people, through information leaflets, through emails, through communications. Who are the first responders? What is the lines to follow? And so we know this is a gap that we have at the moment. And then lastly, the creation of collaboration to work as an institutional team through CPS, Res Life, SAPS, everybody coming together and every now and then talking about the issue. Where are we at? How do we report this? How do we respond effectively? And how do we bring the first responders that are now trained and capacitated to deal with this issue forward in making sure that our students and staff feel safe enough that they will be taken care of, and then they'll be walked through the criminal justice system through the trauma that they've experienced. So that's mine, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Naythan, for your presentation, and thank you for taking us through the available support. And one key takeaway from your presentation, which has been emphasized by Prof. Frantz, is stakeholders in the institution are working in silos. And I do hope that after this session, we are all going to come together as UWC to improve our response to GBV. And you are also pointing to a very important factor, the issue of first responders. It is really necessary that first responders be trained and so that they are easily reachable by both students and staff. Thank you so much for highlighting these key issues. Can we now move on to Nadia Solomon from the Human Resources Desk?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ngabaza, and good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to one and all to this specific webinar on sexual harassment. I have elected to not do a slideshow, as the information that I would want to share is simply way too vast, given the nature and the importance of the topic of discussion. Instead, I was asked to simply talk to the ER protocols in dealing with complaints relating specifically to sexual harassment. And so the question is, what is considered sexual harassment? And in a nutshell, sexual harassment is unwanted attention or conduct of a sexual nature that is persisted in. Although it can be a single action. So it's not necessarily that it has to specifically be persisted in. It can be a single action that would, depending on what the nature of the behavior is, or what the nature of the attention is, or how the receiver of the attention perceives the attention, it can be considered sexual harassment. So one can see that the focus is not necessarily on what the transgressor meant with the conduct or the behavior. The focus is specifically on the receiver of the attention and how that person felt when engaging when receiving the attention. And so therefore one can see that it's so important, you know, in terms of understanding the university's policies and procedures. We do have a sexual harassment policy in place. We also have a university disciplinary code that in place that everyone is compelled to and required to adhere to. And so in our disciplinary code, it guides us essentially on how one is required to behave. And in the code, it does make a reference to the fact that you have to be courteous toward one another. You have to be professional with one another. And so sometimes we have a tendency as colleagues to sort of transgress that. And so it's so important to be mindful of how you engage with your colleague, your superior, your subordinate at all times when you are in the workplace, and maintain and ensure that your behavior is professional at all times. And so how do we deal with sexual harassment complaints? So under normal circumstances, complaints relating to disciplinary or misconduct get sent to the Executive Director, Human Resources, Mr. Meko Magida. And Mr. Magida will then allocate that specific complaint to the ER office through myself, the Employee Relations Manager. Generally, when it comes to complaints of sexual harassment, my experience at UWC has been that there has been instances where the complainer responds immediately, although oftentimes the experience is that when someone is subjected to sexual harassment, they are often in a state of confusion. The person or the receiver of the attention or the victim, they are not necessarily sure what is happening to them. And oftentimes it's not they themselves who will directly come out and say, well, this actually happened to me. Oftentimes we experience it's a line manager who comes forward that has noticed certain behavior, or it's a colleague, or it's a close friend or confidant that the person has elected to confide in. So once we receive the complaint, I think that the first protocols in terms of our processes, we engage and we alert the Gender Equity Unit. So they are made specifically aware that we have now, the ER office has now received a complaint of sexual harassment. Sometimes it can be the other way. Sometimes the complaint goes direct to the Gender Equity Unit. And so vice versa, what then happens, the Gender Equity Unit will immediately alert the Executive Director, Human Resources, and the Employee Relations Office. And so once we receive that specific complaint, we have to unfortunately ensure that we follow the necessary protocols. So whomever has been identified as the perpetrator or the transgressor or the alleged transgressor, we have to ensure that we issue a notice of investigation to that particular employee before we commence with anything. So that person gets the actual notice of investigation along with the actual complaint letter. So, because they have to know what it is that they are being investigated for. So we literally tell them by giving them a copy of the complaint letter. If we do have a complaint letter, the victim or the complainant essentially is also, I think, one of the first things that we do is that we refer the person to the UWC wellness program for counseling and trauma support if that particular support is required or needed. And generally we will gauge with the employee to what extent that particular support and counseling services are required. And the onus is then up to them to either take it up or go their private route if that is what they decide. The HR consultant of the specific unit is also generally involved as a method of support to both the line manager who is required to initiate, as well as to the victim, as well as in essence to the transgressor, because the role of employee relations in HR is essentially to be neutral in the entire process, so as to ensure that absolute fairness is meted out in terms of how we deal with this. And so for that reason, we essentially, once the notice of investigation has been allocated and the copy of the complaint letter has been communicated, we then go about ensuring that we, through an investigator, collate whatever evidence we are able to. So we ask for a response, we ask for statements, we look and determine whether or not there is video footage, any other evidence that is available to us, we collate and we compile essentially a report, and that information is then provided to a sexual harassment panel. So this particular panel is made up of the employee relations representative, who is not also the person that investigated the complaint. It's someone else. It is made up of a representative from the Gender Equity Unit. It is made up of a representative of the law faculty, as well as the proctor. So the panelists on, it's a sexual harassment panel that is made up of various different employees, and they then sit and they peruse the evidence that has then been provided to them. Their main task is essentially to determine whether or not there's prima facie evidence of wrongdoing on the part of the alleged transgressor. And once they peruse the evidence, they have the right to, in essence, interrogate not necessarily only the evidence, but also whomever they feel they need to still speak to. So if they feel that they need to speak to an additional witness, or that we've left out a witness, or that there's more information that they require to make a decision, they then can commission for that to be presented to them. They can schedule meetings with both the complainant, they can schedule meetings with the respondent, and so they go about determining whether or not there is evidence of wrongdoing. And once they've concluded, they then provide a one-page report to the Executive Director, Human Resources, and the Employee Relations Manager. So if there is evidence of wrongdoing, the natural response of the university is in essence to then take the matter and charge the employee. And so we will then make a determination. So sometimes, depending on the extent of the sexual harassment and depending on the response of the victim of sexual harassment, sometimes an apology is required. Sometimes the nature of the transgression is so bad that we would take it into a hearing and we would ask for dismissal because the trust relationship has now been broken. The impact of the conduct has had a negative impact on the trust relationship, and so we then ask for termination of service. And so it can go from one extreme to the other, or it can be very, it can be as simple as the employee just simply wanting the help and the support in facing the transgressor and saying to that person, you owe me an apology and I now want an apology from you because you did X, Y, and Z. But naturally the ER office will support, and we will determine that the nature of the transgression, at times, even if the employee feels that he or she just wants a response, will require, for purposes of consistency, that we in actual fact go the route of taking it through a disciplinary inquiry. And obviously there a chairperson gets appointed and the case is initiated by the line manager of the transgressor, and the matters, then the employee is in charge with sexual harassment, and the chairperson then makes a decision as to guilt, as well as a sanction that gets imposed relative to whether or not the employee is guilty. I think that one of the things that I did mention at the beginning was the importance of getting the transgressor, the victim of sexual harassment, the necessary trauma support and counseling. And that is very important because oftentimes this person sits, and we've experienced it on a number of occasions, where this person sits with this information not being sure what actually happened to him or her. And there are times when, despite the process that gets followed, and the outcome is that perhaps there isn't guilt on the part of the transgressor, but what the receiver of the attention perceived, there might still be trauma, and there might still be a need for counseling and support. And that is why the role of the HR consultant and the role of the wellness support functionality is so important. And we make sure that that person gets that relative support that is required of them. And so essentially in that way, the HR office partners with the Gender Equity Unit in ensuring that any claims or any complaints relating to sexual harassment is then being dealt in this very concise way, where we follow the very clinical protocols in ensuring fairness that is meted out to both the victim of sexual harassment as well as the alleged transgressor, up until the point where we've established guilt and a sanction is then being meted out by a chairperson. And that, in essence, is how we respond from an HR perspective to complaints through the university protocols of sexual harassment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for this valid information. Sexual harassment is indeed a huge challenge in higher education institutions. It is really comforting to note that we have a policy and we do have processes and protocols in place at the institution. Now we move over to Clint from Campus Protection Services. Over to you, Clint.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to ask Melody just to pop up my slides. Like Naythan, it seems like I've got some technical challenges on my side as well. Thank you, everyone, for listening this afternoon and lending your ears. And thank you for Gender Equity for providing this platform where we could share very critical information. In my start, let me start off with a quote by John F. Kerry, where he says, gender-based violence anywhere is a threat to peace and security everywhere. And I think critically, our role within the campus community is to ensure that there's peace and ultimate safety as we offer security. The pillars that we stand by, or the value pillars that we stand by, is respect, integrity, innovation, service delivery, and then ownership in itself. Before I go on to the next slide, I'd like to just speak to, just very briefly, some of the interventions that we have as we work with the collective on campus. So we work with community health services or community health or health center, CHC, CSSS, gender equity itself, and various other stakeholders on the campus community itself. We do various interventions with them as it relates to gender-based violence. And for the purpose for this particular presentation, it will deal with the harsh nature as it relates to rape per se, and the processes and protocols followed by CPS in itself. We're also very appreciative of CSSS for capacitating our staff as it relates to rape and our response in relation to that itself. Also gender equity by providing our security officers with softer skills. Often the security officers is deemed as having a very harsh and hard approach because our role is to enforce the rule of law as it is prescribed to us for the campus community itself. And then also we've got other interventions through our Safe Campus project, and that's an ongoing project which seeks to provide safety on our campus at large. And one of the implementations we've done at recent was our Safe Walk, which leads all the way to our residences and into our academic space. Melody, you may go to the next slide. So for rape per se, it is a Schedule 3 offense. It has very serious ramifications, and our approach or our response generally to rape in itself is one, would send a security officer out, and it would often be a CPS supervisor, and he would basically secure the scene where it is possible and applicable. He'd also call for additional support services, and often it would either be someone from CSSS or the Res Admin Office. And like I've earlier mentioned as well, that our CPS supervisors have been fully trained as it relates to first responder. And again, thank you to the CSSS office with regards to that. Our control room then would contact one of our investigations officers. They would also come out and provide further support as it relates to the South African Police Services, who would then ultimately take over the scene. Counseling services will then be provided, obviously in a conducive environment, and that would be sourced again through CSSS or Res Admin as well, if it should be taking place on a residence. Statements then will be taken only when appropriate. As we know, these type of occurrences does create great and massive trauma. And often it is obviously that we try and take statements when it is conducive to do so and at an appropriate time. The South African Police Services ultimately takes charge of the scene, and in short, it's called FCS, but it's also known as the Family Violence, Child Protection and Sexual Offences Office that will then basically take over the scene, and also, like Naythan indicated, to the Tutuzela office, try and preserve the forensics information and things that may occur there. South African Police Services then develop a case number. There will then be a docket that will open, and that will be open for court proceedings should it escalate to that particular level, and if suspects has been positively identified. Let me go on to the next slide, Melody. So important to note when a situation of rape does occur is one, to try and report it immediately, and especially within a 72-hour spacing for forensic purposes. Evidence often gets lost if longer, and best is not to shower or take a bath, because to preserve the evidence for the office to obviously ensure that there's a successful apprehension of those individuals. Secure the scene if crime has been committed in your own dwelling or residence. And then the partners that we work with regards to just our interventions, and these are external partners. These are community policing forums, our neighborhood watches, Business Against Crime, our VR SIDS, and there's a lot more other guys as well. May go on to the next slide. Then important contact details to take off is the Family Violence Forum, like I've indicated earlier, the Student Support Services, Campus Health, our Campus Protection Services emergency number right on top. That is very critical for you to have. Our Belfast SAPS office, the Belleville South SAPS office, and the emergency contact number of the City of Cape Town. Future interventions, you may just go back quickly, Melody. Future interventions from our side, we are engaging with Res Admin, CSSS, Gender Equity on developing a victim empowerment room. We've identified a whole bunch of locations. At this point in time, it's looking at all the protocols required to sharpen and strengthen this particular partnership. We're also looking to invest in a self-defense classes for students and staff, and that's something that we're looking to develop down the line in the pipeline. Colleagues, that is it in a nutshell. I thank you for your time, and I trust that the information was informative enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clint, for sharing how our campus responds and how other partners work with you to manage crime and crime scenes. And thank you also for the critical contact details that you provided at the end. I'm just wondering where people can get these details beyond your presentation.
These details can be found on the website itself. Often I get a lot of inquiries from students on the website, and then to our staff on our intranet as well.
Thank you very much for that information. Before we move on, may I take us one step back? I noticed that there's a critical question from Selena there that Nadia Solomon might want to respond to before we move forward.
Yes, thank you. I think one of the questions that was asked is whether or not, does it not seem to cover issues on student and student sexual harassment? Is HR involved in that aspect? And what I can say is that from an HR perspective, we only deal with UWC staff. So anything relating to a student is referred. So we won't have jurisdiction that is referred to the Proctor's office. If, however, a student complains of a staff member being the perpetrator, or the transgressor, then we will receive the information from the student. The student then becomes the victim and the complainant, and the alleged transgressor is then dealt with through the ER office. So that would not necessarily go to the proctor's office. But if the transgressor is an actual student, then that would go through the proctor's office, because the proctor's office would follow a different protocol in terms of the disciplinary processes. They will have a process in place as well, and obviously they deal with it through an investigation process and a hearing process. And the definition of sexual harassment doesn't change essentially either. So the process will in essence be similar, and it will in essence be dealt with, but just from an ER perspective, we wouldn't have the necessary jurisdiction. It would have to go through to the proctor's office to deal with the student specifically. I hope that sort of answers that specific question.
Thank you for your response. May I abuse my position also and ask who really communicates with students directly about policies and processes around sexual harassment, particularly concerning the student body?
Sorry, I'm uncertain who would, if that question is sort of directed at me specifically, but I know from a discipline perspective, it would also necessarily be the student, it would be the proctor's office who would deal with any transgressions relating to matters pertaining to students specifically.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nadia, for your response. Maybe later someone will respond to this as we go on. We now move on to our last presenter for this panel, Lloyd, who is going to talk to us about the visibility and inclusivity of trans and diverse persons at the university. Over to you, Lloyd.
My wounds bleed out onto the words that flow from my pen across the parchment of paper I poorly capped from the roller's grasp. My screams are silenced by the tears that drown out my soul and steal away my voice. But here, on this blank canvas that captures the chaos from the depths of my mind, my voice is able to echo out in alarm to those who pay enough attention to even listen to me. I've long since learned my place, and therefore I silently blend strategically into the backgrounds like vintage wallpaper, riddled with designs that cause me to go unnoticed, just so that you could have enough motivation to paint over me, like a correction to a scandalous mistake that never seemed to have ever occurred. Public relations management. I think that's what they called it in the corporate sector. At home, we just say they're trying to save face, like the rushed wedding to hide her pregnancy that was all too but of shame. But this pain you can't solve by marrying the predator to the victim. So I'm told, but yet some countries dared to even try. And so we tactically deny its occurrence. Did it really happen? And if by some chance, then we craftily minimize its effects by using a fixer or questioning her word, her voice, and in full, the story of her truth, and tragically, the truth behind her pain. If you don't admit it, then it did not happen. If it's not repeated in gossip, it cannot become known. And if a rumor goes out, well, there are ways to make things disappear or stay quiet too. We cover up the truth with something more juicier or silence it at the source, but surely and slowly enough, it becomes nothing than the ripped out pages that turn to embers that build up the bones discarded in the skeletons of our graveyard closets. The very darkened, capped closet, which fills to the brim till the guilt, the consequences, the lies, the secrets, the trauma and suffering become so much and insufferable to bear that they break out those very hinges and force open the multitude of locks as it spills out the secrets for the world to see, acknowledge, and act as though this is the first time they are ever witnessing such a sight. But here again lays another RIP, telling you that lip service only goes so far. Actions are soon forgotten, blankened profiles and silent faces, and standing in solidarity marches end until its next anniversary. But the ongoing carnivorous rate of both brutally attacked bodies and lives go unnoticed due to religious and patriarchal beliefs, because nothing, absolutely nothing, seems just enough to change in comparison to the grieving who are too exhausted to add yet another profile to the ever-growing list of hashtag Me Too. Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you for allowing me the time to share with you on this platform. 16 days of activism towards a world without violence against women and children is something that reigns close to me because I fall under the hashtag Me Too. Through this presentation, we've heard various different ways in which to try and move from a process of awareness and try and create some change. And although the policies at UWC is still in development for trans issues, I thought it would be just to share with you my personal journey and try and help you understand the underlinings behind my own life and the reason for my work. So like I said, my name is Lloyd Zonarex Chetty, and I am the Departmental Administrator at Religion and Theology here at the University of the Western Cape. But I'm also so much more, as you will soon discover. My work in the fields of gender and sexuality stems from my own journey, sexual awakening, discovering my gender identity, as well as unpacking years of personal trauma and experience with abuse and violence. Being a survivor and trying to live after one's body has been broken has proven to be difficult. Through the years, I've channeled my pain into creative outputs that I've used so that my shame, my sinful nature, the taboo of my life, and my broken body could be used as a form of artistic expressionism to blur the lines of gendered anatomy and create non-binary visuals that range from portraits to videos, paintings, poetic pieces, and performance art that is inspired by fashion, abuse, an overly state of emotional being, and the beauty of both the masculine and feminine form. So, shall we begin? Sex, sex, sex. Wow, don't you love and just hate that word? The heaviness and taboo associated with a single word, which can give an immense amount of power in just minutes of use. Which is kind of ironic given that sex is needed for the creation of life and creation is needed for life to grow. A quick few minutes of, as we were told, biological parts A and B, connecting and moving till someone has a happy ending. But how often is that ending truly happy, consensual, or even understood? The reason why I opened my topic on sex is because as a person of difference, sex is naturally what people first see when they see me. Ever heard the saying, never judge a book by its cover? Well, I have been judged based on the stereotype. I know that I'm Indian and the Kama Sutra is of Indian origins, but there's much more to me than what happens between the private spaces of my bedroom. Unfortunately, due to the taboo, shame, and sinful fetish associations with my lifestyle and wardrobe choices, the happenings of my bedroom are what people's thoughts first beeline to. This is followed by the more detailed taboo of my MSM relations, then the sinful nature of my lifestyle and how ungodly it is, followed by how my mannerisms, characteristics, and wardrobes just scream out for attention. And then at some point, they pause to ask, who is this morphe, abomination, cross-dresser, sex worker, etc.? You see, growing up, I never fit into the stereotype cast for male. I guess my parents couldn't afford the typical men's starter pack. And so I was born with the equipment downstairs but a completely different instruction manual upstairs. In essence, I would say that my Ken Barbie body came with a strawberry shortcake cookbook. Like many of the different community, I did not know I was different until much later, when my cute behavior started becoming cause for concern and family meetings turned into religious interventions for correction. Due to growing up in a conservative community, and a Christian home, sex talk or even the mention of sex was not just taboo, but saying it had repercussions. Even when I was in matric, I couldn't watch soapies because my dad would get angry enough to cause damage and break our television set or hurt somebody. Whilst people do understand that this does shield a growing child from the adult happenings of the world, it also blinds them to the dangers and, dare I say, demons that surround us. And in this case, it proved to be tragically true. My parents, elder brother, and I lived with my uncle, cousin, and gran in my gran's 3-bedroom home back in Phoenix, Studden. My parents and uncle worked away, and so they were out of house from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. My gran was heavily involved in the church and was away most of the day. My brother was often with his friends, and so was my cousin. Well, that was until friends came home and I wasn't alone any longer. When I was first introduced to sexual activities, it was as a game, and I did not know any better because the conversation about those birds and the bees was never had with me for my own protection. The game first started when I was 5 years old and continued with different players until I was 12. Unlike most games, I had to swear to secrecy to play this one. And given that I was constantly locked indoors and not exposed to the outside world, it was the only time I saw or had friends. And so as a child experiencing the unknown, I had suffered for 7 years in silence. During these years, sexual abuse was not the only violence I was exposed to. My uncle was a daily drug addict and alcoholic, and most of the reason why I was confined to my bedroom, unless I was going to school or church, as he was not just vulgar, but rude and physically abusive also. Sad to say that he wasn't the only alcoholic either. You see, my dad followed his track record on a month end, with his anger being buffered by my mother who stood in the way and had to experience the worst of it. I remember days back then when my mother and father's conflicts took toxic and concerning turns that had me crying from the corner of the room or sitting in my bed shaking and wondering what is going on. Somehow, the cause for their conflicts was turned to and religiously blamed on my mother's lack of housewife duties, although she worked just as long hours as my father did. Domestic violence and abuse had become a daily happening in my living environment. Love was shown with questionable behaviorisms, and sex had become a corrupted childhood game that caused just as much pain and shame from the exposure that could cause the taboo to silence us no matter how close it was to home. When I was in grade 7, I remembered the day clearly, sitting in front of my life orientation class as the teacher's pet, and the teacher began the first lesson on sex, sexual abuse, and sexual assault. There are moments in my life when my world was often unearthed, and I would become both sick to my core and overwhelmed with so much emotions that I would either faint, cry, or run out. And this time, the latter had won. I was home in record time and in a shower, scrubbing away at my skin until it bled. But unfortunately, memories could not be removed with a simple soap and orange sack. I'd later that week confided in an adult neighbor, a Muslim woman who I had developed a friendship with. And I recall telling her what was going on and her shaking her head as tears flooded her eyes at the disbelief. She was quick to act, and she became the first heroine of my long story. However, life just got worse from there. But you see, this is also where I learned that the justice system would fail me. After multiple arrests were made, investigations had continued, and I had found myself in court and my story being poked and prodded and unplugged and examined so that the truth could be found. And at the end of it all, the perpetrators had spent a weekend in jail and were released on a laughable amount of bail less than 48 hours later. And I became the target of 9 vengeful teens and 4 angry young adults. The following years would see me move homes multiple times, have life get a whole lot worse, lose my faith, leave the church, surviving my family, having failed suicide attempts, escaping to build a new life, dealing with my brother's found drug addiction, fighting to live, learning to survive past trauma, and all whilst discovering my sexuality, building a career, and trying to heal from my past and present trauma. So that the toxic nature of sex, the discovery of sexuality, and the consequences of a sexual identity could become less of a taboo that marked me sinful, and instead form chapters to the story of my lived reality and shared experiences of the voices behind #MeToo, 16 Days of Activism, Thursdays in Black, and other campaigns. So here I am today to present to you from a state of survival, exhaustion, and unfazed emotion. Trauma did not stop in my life. It continues. But through it all, I have channeled my emotions and expressions, and I'm now able to showcase a more beautiful side of me, the less broken, the more vulnerable, and the more me. It is because of my choice to live that I portray an unapologetic, authentic version of my truth. And in doing so, showcase my individuality, identity, create visibility, and educate people in an effort to raise awareness in both my personal and professional life. I am Naythan, and this is my continued journey. Colleagues, I think I am running a bit short of time. And so I'm just going to check and see if I have 2 minutes to show you my presentation. Can I please? Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd, for sharing your lived realities of violence. And perhaps we can take a minute or two.
Sure. I am just putting up this presentation. There we go. Okay, so for my 2 minutes, I want to share my work with you. I'm not sure if you are fully able to see this.
Yes, we can see it. It's clear.
Perfect. So the advice that I offer is part of my lived experience. The one thing that I have learned over the years is, and in terms of considering a new policy, is to remember that not everyone understands or is aware still of what it means to be a victim, of what abuse and violence is, and also not everyone is able to share their story. The one thing that has kept me going is knowing that the only fear I have is the fear of not having to live at all. That is my first lesson. The second one is conforming to an idea of beauty makes you someone else's version of beautiful. Just because your own idea of beauty is not understood does not mean you are any less beautiful. Bravery, courage, and strength lives in you. You are a powerful being, and people fear your strength because difference causes change, and those who control change control the world. A last bit, and something that I think reigns true to everyone, is that I could have died not having found my true identity. The longer I live, the more I experience. The more I experience, the more I learn about myself and more about who and what I like. My experiences shape my thoughts. They do not control my life. Your story is your truth and your experience and could help save the life of someone in your situation. Do not let them feel alone, and remember that you are not alone either. In developing policy and legislation, we look towards the stories of the many. We remember that education is something that is vital. Finding people whose voices shape our policy is even more important. In this day and age of access to information, it is vast, but taboos around identity and stigma and the things that don't allow us to share these stories because they make us victimized, they make us seem weak, and they make us seem as something that could be outcast and put away from our family, is the reason why many stories are not shared. I myself, having experienced a failed justice system continuously, was so afraid to share my story that when I was in grade 9 and experienced an even greater form of sexual violence, I stayed silent for 8 years until I was strong enough to share my story and know that I would not be the victim of backlash or have those people have a strong sense of revenge towards me. Strength is something that I draw not just from inside, but I draw from the people around me. And I want to say that I'm so thankful to the University of the Western Cape for allowing space for voices like mine and for creating spaces where people like me can still live and have a life and have a voice. I especially want to thank our rector, who has met with me twice on my conversations about changing bathrooms at UWC and allowing for more inclusive space. I understand that the lockdown has put a stop to some of our campaigns, but I look forward to continued engagement with the university, and I look forward to building a better UWC with a better understanding and a better life for staff and students equally. Thank you so much, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Lloyd, for sharing your story. I will just read two comments from our colleagues on the webinar. One says, thank you for your courageous offering of your lived reality, Lloyd. So eye-opening and much needed dive into a marginalized view in society. Your story is awakening and transcending for so many of us. And Lloyd, I honor you and thank you for an incredible sharing from a fellow survivor. And I want to say, thank you, Lloyd, for breathing life into this session, which was meant to be about protocols and processes of responding to gender-based violence. But you have made gender-based violence real. You have really made violence real for us in this session. And I want to believe that as we continue with this webinar, we will all reflect on the realities of what it is that we are dealing with from your sharing. Thank you so much for your courage.
You're most welcome.
Okay, we have come to the end of the first panel, and now we are going to move over to the next panel, which is going to look at what is coming from research, as Dr. Marcel Lott is going to take us through interrupting the cycle of gender-based violence, a gender-responsive and transformative approach. Dr. Lott, can we move over to you?
Thank you, Professor. I think just in keeping with Lloyd's sharing and his courage, I wonder if other people are also feeling that maybe we should just take a moment to reflect and to consider what Lloyd has shared, but also challenged us to. Because as you say, this morning has been about protocols, about policies, and what Lloyd has done, he's taken us to the heart of what we're talking about. So maybe just with your indulgence, if we could just take a second, and then I'll start my presentation with Melody's help.
Thank you for that, Dr.
Thank you, ma'am. Melody, I'm ready if you are. Thanks. Could we go to the first slide, please, Melody? Okay, I think for many of us, 16 days of activism, we've lost our love and our regard for it. And Professor Frantz reminded us about the history of it. And I think what has happened over the years is that it's been a calling card for talk shops, for making many promises. Despite that, people have still died. The violence has not stopped. But this time, there are differences. This time, we come to this space with different initiatives. And so the one is that we now have many documents, policy statements, commitments that have laid our increasing anxieties. And I think Cherith Sanger did a wonderful job in alerting us to what those instruments are. And so just to bring you back to one of those initiatives, on the 4th of February, our president launched the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Response Fund to support the NSP and GBVF national response. So there are funds now earmarked for medium long-term support over a 3-year term, 21 billion from the South African government, Ford Foundation pledged 20.2 million, APSA 20 million, and Anglo-American 30 million. So what I would like to ask you to think about, and if you indulge me, walk with me, you will agree with me that the killing of women, the killing of marginalized groupings, the brutalization of folk like our former speaker, it's almost, become a rite of passage for some people. And previously we've talked about corrective rape, and we've constructed terms to almost make it okay to live with that. And so despite the innovations, if we're looking at what do we mean by gender responsive and a transformative input, our shelters are still poorly resourced. And it's still a site of danger for employees, their clientele groups. GBVF is still directed mainly at women, children, persons or non-gender conforming, LGBTQI communities, marginalized groups, and women with disabilities. What hasn't changed is that perpetrators are men, mainly. And again, our former speakers have spoken about that. What we also have now is the emerging conversations about toxic masculinity. And that in a way would almost suggest that perpetrators, and I say perpetrators, I'm talking about those men with a known history of violence, and those men who may not deliberately harm a woman or child, must be included in the intervention strategies. During the 16 days of activism over the years, we've learned about scope, we've learned about extent, we've learned about the nature of GBVF. We've also learned about definitions and definitional dilemmas, and what it is and how we should be thinking about this, okay? So where do we go from here? What is it that we should be changing? And I think one way to look at, again, what comes out of our home, UWC, other institutions, making sense of our reality. And so Gibbs and, some colleagues, they've looked at what are the main drivers behind gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa. And we know that structural factors, poverty, low education status, food insecurity, gender inequality. Cherith told you about patriarchy, and we're also looking at male entitlement, normalizing violence, social relationships that are influenced by violence, and also issues of conflict, armed and post-conflict, particularly on the continent and in our experience. Then there's the other part, the individual and relationship factors. For many years, academics have looked at the individual factors and relationship factors and said, well, women who have grown up in abusive homes are most likely to choose a partner. And so a lot of the research, in a way, has almost blamed the victim and almost condoned and excused perpetrators, especially when it didn't end in a homicide. And so some of those other issues that we need to think about are the fact that individuals who will continue to use violence don't really know how to communicate in their relationship. There are mental health and substance abuse challenges. There are issues around childhood experiences or exposure to violence, and as well as disability and related challenges. Just about childhood experiences, in a study done on campus, many young male students reported that they had witnessed violence in their own family and in their community, and that they were aware that they held the values that would position them to use violence in their relationship. May I have the next slide, please? So if we're talking about a theory of change and considering the context in order to bring about change, workshops are great, awareness raising campaigns are great, but on its own, it is not going to prevent women or marginalized groups from being murdered. In my experience, and I think I have to put this as a disclaimer, I come from a background of having worked in this area and this body of work for a very long time with victims, child victims, adult perpetrators, doing assessments. And I think I recognize that the involvement of men is integral to where we go with this body of work. So we can't assume that every perpetrator who engages in marches or campaigns, talk shows, speak out, is not going to murder his partner when she confronts him or disagrees or challenges him. We need to be doing more in order to find those men where there are risk markers, and also find those champions that can make a difference, can reach out to other men. And so it's important that we interrogate the context and the societal drivers to explore and to look at what evidence-based data do we have to determine the risk and treatability of those men with known violent responses. So what I'm asking you to think about, I'm asking you to think about those men who will continue to use violence. And what is it that we cannot ignore them? And what are we going to do with those men who probably are committed not to use violence in a relationship or in the context? And so a study with Karopi et al., Professor Frantz, again confirmed that those male students who experience abuse or witness violence in childhood homes were unsure of where or how to seek assistance. So they know that they have a proclivity and that they could use violence, but where do they go? While other young students reported the shame and wearing the shame of all men are perpetrators, almost as a badge of some sort. Again, there are no spaces for men to go. There are no spaces for us to break the cycle by engaging men in the prevention and intervention and the strategies going forward. Can I have the next slide, please? So talking about those men who are not going to stop, who most likely will kill, you know, there are specific markers that have come out of research. And so we know the issues. There is a past history of assault. So they've either assaulted family members, strangers, anybody that has challenged them, confronted them, okay? There's also known history of violating any no contact arrangement. So if a family says to the man, please don't contact her, please give her a break, stay away, he's not going to acknowledge that, not going to abide by it. Or if there's a protection order. There are psychosocial challenges with employment problems. I mean, that's half the country, I guess. Relationship problems, that's the other half of us, I suppose. But what makes it more pertinent with this group of men is the constant use of suicide, the constant homicidal threats. If I can't have you, nobody will. And making attempts to kill himself in order to get her to, you know, forgive him, take him back. And I think in my body of work, some of the sad things have been the father trying to hang himself and the 8-year-old walking into the room, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And when his wife had enough of her children being subjected to the suicidal threat, she beat him up. And that gave rise to the kind of argument, well, men also get abused, some women are violent. Again, the context was overlooked. And so again, individual risk markers, impulsivity, the guy can't control his anger, there's mental health issues often, his behavior is unpredictable. There's also a prior history of assaulting other partners. Again, obsessive jealousy, sexual jealousy. And when we talk to survivors of GBV and F, they would often tell us that he accuses me of sleeping with everybody. She is a shop steward in the factory. And when she goes to meeting, she is subjected to the most humiliating behaviors when she returns because he's convinced that she's sleeping with everybody. often there's sexual assault or threats of sexual assault. So when this kind of man gets arrested and kept in prison or in a police station for 48 hours the first time, it is not unusual for him to recruit other men to commit rape or sexual violence against his partner or even against his children to teach her a lesson. And I think the other issue that came up, these are men that condone domestic violence. Their attitudes and their values, they're the ones who would joke about, women not listening, and the only way they listen is that they get hurt, etc., etc. So the conversations tell us that they condone violence towards women and marginalized people. The issue of stalking, and often there's an escalation in physical abuse or threats. So why am I mentioning this? Could I have the next slide, please? If we're looking at transformation and if we're looking at credible intervention, we have to create and have spaces where men can reach other men in credible and accountable ways. And so when we're looking at policies and protocols, we've got to ensure that it's located in evidence-based theoretical frameworks as well as a socio-legal framework. We can't kind of say, okay, he said he's sorry, he's not going to do it again. So we have a responsibility to ensure that whatever interventions and whatever protocols we think about or want to institute does not escalate harm or risk to women and marginalized groupings because of our own naivety, because we're thinking, no, he's cool, he's, helping with the marches, he's organizing speak outs, he's going to the tavern or shebeen and he's talking to other men about domestic violence, and then he goes home and he sits his partner down and says, have I ever done this to you? He keeps awake the whole night. Have I ever threatened you? Have I ever forced you to have sex, etc., etc.? So we need to be sure that our protocols are clear. We need to be sure that our entire student body and staff are fully cognizant and familiar with protocols. Often we assume that people know. I'm in the Department of Social Work, and I can only talk about, student experiences where they had no clue where to go, who to go, and who to approach, despite the fact that the social students, one would expect their knowledge to be, a little bit more clued up than some other people. So this is information that we've got to keep repeating. We've got to make sure it's visible. There are no spaces for men to seek help. And I think that part of our commitment to prevent, part of our commitment to look at policies and protocols is also to look at those strategies that will help us to create a space for men helping other men before their behavior escalates and it becomes a threat or ends in death. It's unhelpful to demonize and shame, okay? What do we do during this month or this period? We jump on a soapbox and we scream for bigger sentences, for stricter incarceration protocols, and we do things like let's name and shame. Some of that one can understand, but what it does, it simply escalates greater harm to victims, okay? So the situation where he ties his partner to a chair and lights little pieces of paper and says, who's going to believe a gay man when he says or tells people, so do you want me to go to prison? And so that whole kind of thing about using what we put in place to escalate harm to victims. So we've got to think clearly about demonizing, about shaming. And there are debates at the moment about legislation that gags victims, that silences them. But there's another way to think about this. I think education awareness programs are important. It's important for the victim to know what their rights are, what is available to them. But we also need to have those programs where I can identify those male champions who can reach out to prospective perpetrators, and in that way, interrupt that cycle of violence. People don't stop using violence because they know it's wrong. They may stop for a while because they've got caught, and they go to places like Paulsmoor and they sit around, do nothing because, you know, social workers are overloaded. There's not enough psychologists. And so the only time they do something is when they want a parole report. So locking that person up, I'm not talking about your homicidal perpetrator. I'm talking about the guy who hasn't escalated to that extent. So we have to look at what are we going to do? Our student body, our staff, you know, it's a microcosm of South Africa and our neighbors. We're positioned to make a difference. Could I have the next slide, please? So in closing, I think that it's a contentious issue and a contestation to talk about men, especially since they're the perpetrators. But if we want to cross open ground, and if we want to narrow the gap and make a difference, we have to consider involving them in credible, accountable ways. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lont, for reminding us once again. My apologies for the noise in the background, the challenges of working from home. So I was saying, thank you very much for reminding us of the normalization of violence, which is particularly directed at women and children and marginalized and diverse persons. You once again also remind us of the main drivers of gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa as emerging particularly from research, as well as the strategies for breaking this cycle. I want to agree with you that spaces should indeed be created for conscientizing men on violence. And on that note, we will move on to maybe how one group has created such a space. But before I hand over to Glenn to talk to us about how they've created such a space to conscientize men, there is a comment or two that I need to share. Dorian says, I have recently conducted GBV educational workshops with some police officials. I found that there is a gap in their understanding and knowledge of GBV. Some of them do not even know what femicide is. This was quite concerning for me. So I note that this comment talks to what you are raising also, Dr. Lont, that there is this necessity to continue communicating, to continue conscientizing, and to continue teaching about violence, because at times we assume that people understand, we assume that people have knowledge, as you are sharing. Okay, I don't know whether Dr. Lont, you want to react to that comment, or should I move on?
I've extended my time already, ma'am, so thank you.
Okay.
Comment taken, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we now then move on to Glenn?
Good afternoon, Prof. Good afternoon to the members of the executive of the university that's present in this webinar, to members of the panel and those in attendance. It is indeed a privilege and an honor for me to be presenting and be part of a webinar that speaks about gender-based violence. I think Melody, can you just put my slide up? Thank you. Next slide, please. So on this slide, it's basically just the topics that I will be covering. So Melody, you can move to the next one. Okay, so I think most of the speakers today have lamented to the fact that 16 days of activism is simply not enough. And I tend to agree, because I believe that we must not neglect and wait for 16 days in December for us to stand up against gender-based violence and other acts of violence. I believe that it must also not be treated in isolation, but as a nation, as a people, we need to denounce it, and I think pushing for harsher sentences and stricter laws contributes towards eradicating and dealing with such ills. I think we need to be advocates on a constant basis regarding issues of violence, crime, corruption, and many other acts of lawlessness. And I think all of these acts of lawlessness come together, and if we deal with one at a time in isolation, we will not get rid of these social ills. I just want to remind everybody about a famous quote by the former and first democratically elected president of South Africa, Dr. Nelson Mandela, about sport. And he went on to say, and I'm sure everybody's heard the quote before: sport has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire. It has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language that they understand. Next slide, please. So in terms of the word power that came out strongly from the quote of Nelson Mandela, I want to look at it a little bit deeper in this part of my presentation. But I want to start off by saying an observation that I've made is that attitude and behavior of coaches has got a strong correlation to attitude and behavior of our athletes. And power in the sporting world resides with coaches. It resides with sport administrators. It resides with officials within sport. And power is a double-edged sword if it's not used in a way that Nelson Mandela and others before him intended it to be. It can be used on the negative side, and acts of violence, acts of excluding people, acts of many other ills comes into play. But I want to talk about, before I speak about later on in my slide about the men's forum and the role of men, I want to talk about some negatives. In sport, we always hear about locker room talk, where there's forms of abuse against young boys, young men, young girls in sport. When coaches want to instill some motivation or whatever they call, but it is masked with the term, it's locker room talk, and that it is okay. But I believe that it starts something, and it starts to grow at a very young age, where children are being prepared for, especially men, to be perpetrators of acts of violence and many other acts. I think in addition to that, there's also this negative connotation about sport must be about winning. It's about winning at all costs. And later on, I will touch on Oscar Pistorius, where he had a case or a defense mechanism about this. Also on the field behavior, those that are rugby followers and have been watching the game of rugby will recognize that there's been a great change in rugby. I remember as a young boy watching rugby, in my naivety, it was interesting when rugby players, especially our Springbok team, get involved in a fight during the competition. But I'm glad that to a great extent, with strict rules, strict policies, these have changed, and there are things, punitive measures in place, like your sin bin and yellow cards, etc. So that has certainly dealt with these behaviors. Next slide, please. The case of Oscar Pistorius is quite a strong one in the sports circle and in society. We all know what has happened, and to a great extent, the issue of winning at all costs, the innate competitiveness was used in the case to defend Oscar Pistorius. And there's a misconception that being competitive, you must be aggressive in your in your approach to winning, and that brings a negative spin to sport. We know that sport not only caters for elite athletes, but it caters for athletes at all levels. It caters for ordinary people like myself, who used to be an athlete but go for walks. And so the attitudes that's ingrained and enshrined in the way things have been done over the past simply plays a role in developing these if I may use it, and apologies in advance, beasts that we create, little beasts that we create. And so another athlete, the famous Elena Isenbayeva, a Russian athlete who competed for Russia at the Olympic Games, is also a member of the International Olympic Committee Athletes Commission. And she at a safeguarding conference spoke about harassment and abuse within sport. And she highlighted the fact that it goes against, harassment and abuse goes against human rights and can be looked at as criminal in certain cases. And I think in Nadia Solomon's presentation earlier, there's different degrees of when one deals with cases. And so the extreme could be that in this case, that there's criminal acts within the harassment and abuse of power. And so that brings me to when children who participate in sport are being abused and harassed, what are the long-term effects on them? There certainly is. And some of them could be physical due to injuries, and injuries that I believe could have been prevented by putting in proper systems and proper rules in place. Also in terms of it being cognitive, athletes or young players have self-esteem issues because of what harassment and abuse could play in their development and their growth. There's obviously emotional scars that it may leave, and these are, when we speak about the moods of athletes that are very volatile, very erratic, and so on. And then behavior, we also look at what are how do we retain athletes, knowing that an athlete has to be at the Olympic Games, or the Olympic Games winning age is 28, but you hear of an athlete that drops out at the age of 19 or at the beginning of university years. We also, other behavioral factors is the fact that athletes then move to using substances to ensure that their performances are at a certain level. And then we look at what are the mental challenges. There's depression, which we all know very well, and COVID has obviously played a major role in depression, anxiety, and ultimately suicide. And then there's your relational factors. So you look at exclusion. How are kids, or how do they exclude themselves because of behaviors within sport? And then economic factors is that we know sport has become professionalized, and prize monies and endorsements also plays a role. And due to abuse, harassment, this can all then lead to losses, great losses for athletes, and it has huge long-term effects. Next slide, please. So in sport, at UWC, as an example, I want to talk about a possible remedy or a major contributor that deals with gender-based violence or fights against gender-based violence. I think firstly, as a department, we've taken a decision, and as the director always say, we are unapologetic about the fact that we support women. We support women because they have been neglected for many, many years. We know as young girls, young women, especially coming from rural backgrounds, township backgrounds, could not participate in sport because they've got to clean, because society says so. They've got to cook, they've got to take care of the household at times. And so our stance is that opportunities are what is important, and opportunities at all levels, opportunities to say, when we have a men's soccer team, there must also be a team equally to that for our ladies. When we have a leadership position, we must create leadership positions for women. And it is not about creating positions so that women can fit in, but it's about developing women and making sure that women are equal at the tables. And so as a department, that is what we've done. Now, at the forefront of that is men that is there. For those that know our department, the director is a male. The support services manager, which is myself, acting sometimes as the deputy director or acting as director in his absence, is a male. So as men, what do? We have to take, we've adopted a stance that we have to take charge to ensure that women are at the center of what we do, and women are not left behind, women are taken care of. So when we look at our, why then the men's forum? So the men's forum is, and I think a couple of speakers have lamented on the fact that men are normally your perpetrators of gender-based violence. That's generally speaking, but we also know men are vulnerable. Men are sometimes also victims of gender-based violence. And so our forum addresses quite a number of issues, but how do we do it? It starts off by having just general discussions with men and bringing them together so that men can air their views, men can look at what are the issues that affect us and how can we assist in eradicating issues of gender-based violence. And maybe what we need to look at is there a possible space for a women's forum? We could always look at it. How do we then promote or awareness campaigns against gender-based violence? I think one of the avenues is through our sporting events, but are we not reactive at times? I remember with JCS, when we hosted the Varsity Cup rugby competition, we had a photo of JCS up, but is that not too late because she has already been killed? You know, should we not do things up front? But I think it's engagements like this that is putting us and reminding us that there's more to be done, and there's more can be done when we work in collaboration with one another. I've just been reminded that my time is basically up. So I just want to, before I finish, what is it that we do at UWC in addition? We aligned ourselves with the federations, the South African Olympic Committee, by adopting and engaging on safeguarding policies, in so that our director is actually on the Olympic Committee's safeguarding subcommittee. And one of the stances that we've taken as one of the first universities in South Africa, sports departments, is that all coaches must have a police clearance in order to be given a contract at UWC. And there's many others. I can share the presentation, but I think because my time, I've been informed that my time is up, I will unfortunately have to pause. And so thank you very much for listening to the presentation, colleagues. Prof, before you go, I just want to show my T-shirt. If everybody can see, I'm not sure if everybody can see.
Yes, we can see you, Glenn.
Thank you. So this is again one of the initiatives that we as a department have taken to ensure that we fight against gender-based violence throughout the year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Glenn, for sharing with us. I want to agree with your opening statement where you say we should all fight against gender-based violence every day as it occurs every day. I want to agree with you on that statement. And thank you also for reminding us of the power in sport, and also for unpacking the gendered nature of sport to us. I'm quite sure my students would be very excited to listen to you, as this is one of their learning areas. This is a space where, as you say, aggression is celebrated and normalized, but with time it becomes detrimental, particularly to young people. Thank you also for your responses to GBV as the sports fraternity. This connects very well with what Dr. Lond shared earlier on, that we need spaces where men could be conscientized, and you are sharing that you are creating such a space. And as an institution, we appreciate what you have done. Before I move over to our last speaker of the day, I need to apologize for time, which I see has gone, but at the same time, I think we really needed to listen to everyone we listened to. Earlier on, I asked a question on what happens particularly to the student body as far as sexual harassment is concerned. I just want to draw your attention to a response from Prof. Dube in the chats, where she responds to the question that I raised. So she says, I don't know whether I should read it, but I'm quite sure everyone can see that. So Prof. Dube really gives us a detailed response on what happens and who is involved with sexual harassment as far as the student body is concerned. And thank you, Prof, for that response. Okay, can we now move to our final speaker of the day, Maria van Studden from Gender Equity Unit. Maria, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, all our participants who's in the webinar. I think this webinar reminds us all of the importance of inclusivity and of fully respecting different perspectives and identities. This afternoon, I also wish to acknowledge the work done by residences and the Office of the Proctor, who is actually part of our human rights cluster, and all other departments who are not represented on this platform, but who is also doing the work of gender-based violence. We really your commitment to this cause is appreciated. I think my presentation this afternoon will focus on the national policy frameworks that guide our institutional GBV strategy, but also mechanisms that will need to put in place to strengthen our institutional response. You can move. Next slide. The policy framework that to address gender-based violence in the post-school education and training system is the Department of Higher Education and the training's response to the multi-sectoral policy and program framework provided by the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. Through the policy framework is to address gender-based violence in the post-school education and training system. The department is creating an enabling environment for the eradication of gender-based violence while instilling respect, protection, promotion, and fulfillment of human rights as enshrined in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. Next slide. We also know within our institution, as mentioned earlier by Nadia, we have our sexual harassment policy for staff, but also the sexual violence policy for students, which actually outlines the process of if a student report a case, what steps need to be taken to address that. And also it will outline this, the officers and their roles and responsibilities that they will be fulfilling. I think the following slide illustrates the goals of the policy framework, which can be encapsulated as follows. Now, go back to the following, previous slide. Sorry for that. Can we go back to the previous slide, Melody? Yeah. This slide actually outlines the goals of the policy framework that I will refer to, and it's about the creation of an enabling environment to inform, prevent, support, monitor GBV in the institution. It also one of the goals is to promote safety of all students and staff by putting in place comprehensive awareness and prevention programs intended to raise awareness of policies and services addressing GBV, as well as other measures aimed at preventing incidents of GBV. It's also aimed to put supportive, efficient, and repetitive assistance procedures to complainants, survivors in place. I think we've mentioned that earlier, that there are a lot of policies, guidelines, etc., procedures. How do we access that? The next slide. On the 27th of August 2021, the following guidelines were released, and these guidelines will help us to operationalize the sectoral GBV policy framework. These instruments are directives to all institutions and management to operationalize the necessary infrastructure for a comprehensive response to cases of sexual and gender misconduct, rape, and sexual assault across all campuses. More awareness raising will be done as we continue. Can we go on? Next slide. I think for us as the Gender Equity Unit, our mandate is really to coordinate the institutional GBV strategy. And it is to reinforce the efforts. I think we all heard about all the different programs, interventions that are happening on campus. And I think it's to reinforce these efforts towards coordination, monitoring, evaluation, and reporting of departmental GBV response. It's also to expand research and information on gender-based violence, but also explore funding, the best funding model to address GBV on campus. Next slide. GBV in particular is an institutional problem, and affects all who are a part of this institution. This recognition demands a critical reflection and interrogation of existing structures, hierarchies, and systems throughout the university, which could give rise to gender biases, discrimination, and exclusion. Therefore, review of all our policies to ensure that all our policies, the implementation of our policies, and the way that we carry out our functions are non-discriminatory and fair and inclusive. Gender-based violence is both a cause and a consequence of gender inequality. So it's a must to address gender inequality as a core element in all our efforts to tackle GBV. Gender-based violence form part of the scope of the gender audit, that a tool that was designed by the Gender Equity Unit, and that tool is to identify the gaps within our interventions, our policies, our systems, but also to identify the best practices. So in essence, this is what we would like to conclude this day today, the coordination of the GBV strategy, and I think all the activities that we will be involved in. I think taking an integrated approach will allow us to build on our institutional expertise, and it will provide us a better outcomes when dealing with gender-based on campus. I thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for sharing the Gender Equity Unit strategy. At this point, I want to conclude by saying, I hope you will agree with me that from all the presentations of the day, we realize that as an institution, we have policies and strategies in place to respond to gender-based violence. Academics have done research and they are prepared to work with all stakeholders for a strengthened response to GBV. With those words, I want to say, unless if there are any comments, questions, I want to say thank you all presenters and thank you all participants. We have come to the end of our webinar.